When you talk about those great marquee franchises in the NFL, one team that always comes up is the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is a team that has decade after decade of excellence throughout their history. This is a team that has consistently been a winner by and large over the past 4+ decades, with some gaps in between, but largely has been a winning organization the past 4+ decades. No team has won more Super Bowls than the six that the Pittsburgh Steelers have. I believe no team has played in more Super Bowls than the eight that the Pittsburgh Steelers have. So this is again a marquee model franchise for the NFL. And one of the things to me that's so impressive about the Pittsburgh Steelers, with all these teams over the years that change their head coaches every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, over the past 45 years, the Pittsburgh Steelers have had three head coaches. That is the recently departed Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin. And that stability at the top counts for something, and it obviously does when you look at the results of the history of the organization. But the funny thing is as much as the Pittsburgh Steelers are viewed as a model marquee franchise in today's NFL, that was not always the case. From the 30s to the 60s, the Pittsburgh Steelers were one of the most snake-bitten franchises in the NFL. They were easily one of the worst franchises in the NFL, consistently missing the playoffs, no championships, no championship game appearances to their record. This is a franchise that a lot of people loved the owner, Art Rooney, had tremendous respect for him and how he helped change the game. But ultimately, there weren't great results for him and his team. And, this is an organization. It's funny, the last video I did was about the Philadelphia Eagles' five greatest players. There was a point in time during World War II that rosters got so depleted due to, players having to go answer the call to service from the government in the military, that they actually merged with the Eagles to become the Steagles for a season, believe it or not. But all of that changed in 1969 with the hiring of Chuck Noll. Once that occurred, everything else changed, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Steelers, like I said, 6 Super Bowl titles, 8 Super Bowl game appearances, a lot of great history and tradition and winning championship pedigree, both at the team level and the individual level. A team with a lot of Hall of Famers, and it was hard to do this top five list. Look at some of the names that got left off of the list. Hall of Famers like Jack Butler and Bullet Bill Dudley and Lynn Swann and Franco Harris and John Stallworth and Mel Blount and Rod Woodson and other guys that could be in the Hall of Fame someday. Oh, forgot Dermonte Dawson, another Hall of Famer. Guys like Andy Russell, a guy that I think should be enshrined in Canton. A guy like a Hines Ward, who some people will argue should be enshrined in Canton. A guy like Troy Polamalu, who may very well end up in Canton. A guy like Big Ben, who as a quarterback of the Steelers has led the team to 3 Super Bowls and won 2 of them. He's a guy that has a Hall of Fame argument in his favor. So again, not the easiest list to do because I was ultimately going to leave some really good players off of the list, but ultimately that's the name of the game. And that's what you have to do. Now, it shouldn't be surprising to any of you that the majority of this list will be comprised of Steelers from the Steel Curtain teams of the 70s that won 4 Super Bowls in a 6-year stretch. That's a standard of excellence that few could ever match. So it shouldn't be that surprising. All the great players on that team, all the great Hall of Famers on that team, this list was going to be dominated by those Steelers of the 70s, in particular on the Steel Curtain side of the ball. But let me talk now about the 5 greatest Pittsburgh Steelers of all time. Number 5, Terry Bradshaw, first overall pick out of Louisiana Tech in the 1970 NFL Draft. Things weren't always smooth for Terry Bradshaw. His relationship with Chuck Noll was icy at best, shaky for sure. And the first few years of his career, he really struggled. He really struggled to catch up to the NFL game. He struggled with seeing eye to eye with Chuck Noll. And the funny thing is, the first time that they won the Super Bowl in that '74 season was actually Joe Gilliam that started the season as a starting quarterback and not Terry Bradshaw. Now, when you look at Terry Bradshaw, though, you could sit there and say, well, statistically, he's not the greatest quarterback of all time. I think he had 212 touchdowns, 210 interceptions in his career. A lot of people are going to say, well, he's only on your list because he won 4 Super Bowl rings. Well, yeah, in part. At the end of the day, especially as a starting quarterback, you are ultimately defined by your wins and losses and when those wins and losses occurred. And Terry Bradshaw is one of 2 quarterbacks in NFL history to win 4 Super Bowl titles. Joe Montana, of course, being the other. There's something to be said about that. And Terry Bradshaw, even though he wasn't the greatest statistically, especially earlier in his career, even though he had some good years later in his career statistically, he always seemed to find a way to play big and make the big play in the big time spots, in the big time moments, in the biggest of games when the Steelers needed it the most. So whereas everybody will always think about, well, Bradshaw had, Mike Webster, another guy that got left off of this list that could have very easily been on here, another Hall of Famer. He had him blocking for him, and he had Franco Harris in the backfield, and Swan and Stallworth at receiver. He had Rocky Blyer back there, another very good player. He had that steel curtain defense. Well, yeah, at some point in time, though, a quarterback's got to be able to win games when it's needed. And we get that selective memory that the Steel Curtain always won every single game for that team every single time. And you look in particular at the last 2 Super Bowls that the Pittsburgh Steelers played in, that was clearly not the case against the Cowboys and the Rams. Terry Bradshaw had some big-time moments and some big-time performances and some big-time spots in games. And I think beyond question deserves a spot on this list. You win 4 Super Bowl rings as a quarterback, that tends to put you at least in the top 5 conversation in any organization's history. Number 4, I will go with the player who, through the first 40 years or so of the Steelers organization's history, was the greatest player in the history of the organization. That was Ernie Stoutner, the 22nd overall selection out of Boston College in the 1950 NFL Draft. During his 14 seasons in Pittsburgh, he was the star. He was the man. Even though the Steelers teams weren't always good around him, that's for damn sure. That might be an understatement. Ernie Stoutner was a stud. He is still to this day, even though they technically don't issue a lot of other numbers like Bradshaw's number 12, what have you, the only officially retired number in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers is Ernie Stoutner's number. That should tell you something. A 9-time Pro Bowler, a 10-time All-Pro, a member of the 1950s NFL All-Decade team, a member of the NFL's 50th anniversary team, a guy that, in my opinion, was perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most dominant defensive players of his time, to the point where if he played on a team that won a championship or 2, people would be talking about him as one of the 3 or 5 greatest defensive tackles of all time. Ernie Stoutner was dominant and definitely belongs on this list, and that's why I have him at number 4. Number 3, 2 and 1 all go back to the steel curtain defense of the 70s for the Steelers. Number 3 is Jack Lambert. The funny thing about Lambert, he was a part of that great 74 draft class that produced 4 Hall of Famers for the Pittsburgh Steelers in first-round pick Lynn Swan, fourth-round pick John Stallworth, fifth-round pick Mike Webster, and then here in the second round, they took Jack Lambert, who was and Lambert, easy for me to say, a very tall, skinny kid out of Kent State, about 6'3", 205, 210 pounds. And you look at him and you say, he can't play middle linebacker. Oh, yes, he can. During his 11 seasons for the Steelers, he was really kind of the attitude of that defense. He was the leader of that defense, a 9-time Pro Bowler, a 7-time All-Pro, a member of those 4 Steelers championship teams. There was a reason when he came into the fold in 74, along with those other guys, that they won the Super Bowl that season when a guy like Jack Lambert was a rookie, and then won it again the next year, and then skip a couple years, then they won 2 more. Jack Lambert, one of the great middle linebackers of all time, and one of the great physical, tough, fiery, emotional leaders in the history of the NFL, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and again, deserves a place on this list at number 3. Funny thing is, though, he wasn't the best linebacker on those Steelers teams. That was number 2, Jack Ham, the outside linebacker from Penn State, who was taken in the second round of the 1971 NFL Draft. Jack Ham, by a lot of people, along with Bobby Bell, is widely viewed as the greatest weak side linebacker in NFL history. His ability to play the run, to defend in pass coverage, to be able to blitz opposing quarterbacks is basically second to none, along with, like I said, maybe a guy like a Bobby Bell. During his 12 seasons with the Steelers, an 8-time Pro Bowler, a 6-time All-Pro, he holds the NFL record for the most turnovers by a linebacker with 53, a 4-time Super Bowl champion, a member of the 1970s NFL All-Decade team, a member of the NFL's 75th anniversary team, whereas Jack Lambert a lot of times got more of the press and more of the focus and more of the publicity. Jack Ham was that kind of quiet, reserved guy that was just the better football player, and really in a lot of ways was a key component of what made those steel curtain defenses go in the 70s. But number 1 is the face of that steel curtain defense. Some people might talk about Holmes, and they might talk about a guy like an L.C. Greenwood, a guy, again, that I could have mentioned that I do feel deserves some consideration for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But at the end of the day, was the steel curtain defense really about all 11 players on the defense, or was the steel curtain defense the front four? You tend to gravitate to the front four, and the fixture, the franchise player for those Steelers teams of the 1970s that won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years is undoubtedly Mean Joe Green. He was a 4th overall pick in 1969 out of North Texas. And this was a guy here that Chuck Knowles saw. He envisioned fitting his mold and being able to build his defense and his team around this guy. It started with Mean Joe Green. A lot of people mistakenly believe that it was Chuck Noll and it started with Terry Bradshaw. No, it didn't. It started with the drafting of Mean Joe Green. Mean Joe Green was the Steeler of Steelers in the 1970s. Beyond question to me, the most dominant player in Pittsburgh Steelers history and the most important and significant and greatest player in Pittsburgh Steelers history. This was a guy that when he was brought into the fold, everything else started to change afterwards. But that first linchpin, that first key cog in the wheel was Mean Joe Green. During his 13 seasons with the Steelers, he was a 10-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time first-team All-Pro. He also made the others around him better. Like I said, the guys like the Greenwoods and the Holmeses of the world, the Lamberts. Think about how much easier it was for Jack Lambert to do his job with Mean Joe Green dominating in the middle of the defensive line. You talk about a 2-time NFL Defensive Player of the Year, the key component on the defensive side of the ball to those 4 Steelers championship teams in 6 seasons, a member of the NFL's 1970s All-Decade team, a member of the NFL's 75th anniversary team, and the player that still to this day, I think above all else, is truly, unquestionably recognized as the Steeler of Steelers and the greatest Pittsburgh Steeler of all time. So Steeler fans, let me know what you think of my list down below in the comments. Let me know what your top 5 list of greatest Pittsburgh Steelers of all time is. I'm sure some of you younger fans will go, you got to put Big Ben and Troy Polamalu and Hines Ward on there. Oh, God. All right. Whatever. Thanks for watching.